Good evening, everyone. My name is Guangji Hong from the Department of Geography at the National Taiwan University. It's truly my pleasure to introduce Professor Imre Szeman from the University of Toronto. Professor Szeman is the director of the Institute for Environment Conservation and Sustainability and a professor of human geography. He has held several distinguished positions, including University Research Chair of Environmental Communication at the University of Waterloo and Canada Research Chair of Cultural Studies at the University of Alberta. In 2020, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He also served as the climate critic of the Green Party of Canada from 2021 to 2022. Professor Szeman is a globally renowned scholar whose work has significantly shaped how we think about energy, culture, and political ecology. His research focuses on a fundamental question. Modern societies have been built around oil, but at what cost? And how should we think about justice in a world structured by energy? In his recent book, Futures of the Sun, The Struggles Over Renewable Life, published in 2024, Professor Szeman raises a simple but very powerful question. Who will control the future of the renewable energy, especially something as seemingly universal as the sun? His answer challenges many of our common assumptions. He argues that what we often call energy transition is not simply a transition from one energy source to another. Rather, it is a reorganization of power. When we move from oil to solar or other renewable forms of energy, what is really at stake is who controls energy systems, who gets to define the future, and who is excluded from it. In this sense, energy transition is not just a technical or policy issue, it is deeply political. It involves competing visions of the future, from green capitalism driven by technological innovation to state-led approaches to climate governance, to forms of resistance that seek to preserve fossil fuel-based ways of life. What is especially insightful in Professor Szeman's work is his emphasis on what he calls energy common sense, the taken for granted assumptions that shape how we understand energy in everyday life. He shows us that these assumptions are not natural, but historical constructed, and therefore open to challenge. Earlier today, Professor Szeman gave a talk about green dreams, where he examined what is often called green techno-optimism, the belief that innovation, markets, and new technologies can deliver sustainability without requiring us to fundamentally change our patterns of life, consumptions of energy use. Focusing in particular on big tech, he shows how companies position themselves as leaders in climate solutions through net zero pledges, sustainability reports, and investments in renewable energy, while at the same time their infrastructures, growth models, and increasing energy demands often move in the opposite direction of meaningful use decarbonization. His work reminds us that climate politics are not only shaped by politics or technologies, but also by the stories we tell about them. Stories that shape what we think is possible, what we demand, and what we are willing to accept as our future. For us in Taiwan, these questions feel especially urgent. Taiwan's semiconductor industry is globally significant. It is often described as a kind of silken shield, but sustaining this position requires enormous amounts of energy. As an island with limited resources, how Taiwan secures its energy future has become an increasingly pressing issue. With the rapid expansion of AI, energy demand is only expected to grow further. At the same time, recent political discussions, including debates over the possibility of restart of nuclear energy, have sparked intense public debates. And globally, shifting geopolitical tensions continue to affect energy supply and stability. In this complex situation, Professor Szeman's work encourages us to step back and ask some fundamental questions, such as how should we understand the relationship between energy and society? What kind of future do we want? For scholars in Taiwan, the field of energy humanities is still relatively new. We are familiar somehow with environmental humanities, digital humanities, but energy humanities invites us to think more directly about how energy shapes culture, politics, and everyday life. Professor Szeman has been one of the key figures in developing this very important field, and his work offers important insights for all of us. We are very fortunate to have him with us today. So please join me in welcoming Professor Imre Szeman.
Okay, I have a lot of moving parts here, but thanks to everybody who has been so welcoming to me here at NTU and in Taipei. What I'm going to do here, because energy humanities is not something that many of you might know about, is I'm going to really give you a sense, first of all, of what energy humanities is. Then I'm going to tell you about why it matters. I'm going to show you why it matters. I'm going to show you why it matters to begin with first as well, but I'm going to show you why it matters by telling you about what's happening in Canada with respect to energy, which is something you might not know about. What I want to focus on in talking about why energy matters, where I'm heading towards, is talking about energy and populism, energy and right-wing politics, energy and reactionary politics. So this lecture is going to take part in, this is going to take 3 parts. The first part, I'm just going to give you some framing ideas about what the energy humanities are. Second part will be an actual kind of sense breakdown, almost like a definitional account of the energy humanities. And the third part will be an account of Canada, the one I mentioned now. Okay, so part 1. I'll let you know which parts so you can know where we are and you won't get too bored, okay? So part 1. So that means you have 2 parts left, so just know. So I want to talk about 3 images, since I think they'll give you some sense of the big questions driving the field of study known as the energy humanities. And they'll give you some sense too of that these are more than technical questions of interest only to university professors and researchers. The basic claims of the energy humanities are quite simple, it seems to me. First, the energy humanities makes the claim that energy matters not just for cars or motorcycles, or even in geopolitics or business spreadsheets, but it matters for the shape and character of our societies and cultures as well. Some of this, I think, is easy to see. Okay? Modern societies would not be what they are today without energy and the use of ever more energy, more and more energy with each passing year. We're creatures of energy living in a world that has been shaped for 175 years around a specific kind of energy, a very intensive kind of energy, an energy-intensive energy. Actually, when we say energy, we mean fuel, right? So a very energy-intensive kind of fuel, which are fossil fuels. Moving past the use of an ever-increasing amount of fossil fuels, getting away and an ever-increasing amount and still increasing despite the addition of huge amounts of renewable energies. Getting away from fossil fuels means figuring out all the ways that this kind of fuel has shaped our cities and where we live and what we do. So that's the easy part to see, I think. The harder part to see is how fossil fuel energy has shaped many of the most important and deeply held ideas and ideals that we have, including freedom, mobility, growth, the importance of the individual, the future, and indeed the whole point of life in very essential ways. An easy way to see how energy has shaped us is, for instance, something I talked about earlier today a little bit, is in the system of automobility, which has resulted in freeways and wide streets and unwalkable cities in much of the world. So that's a simple way. A harder way is to think about how the system has reinforced individuality and notions of freedom through movement, so that we fear not having automobiles anymore and breathe a sigh of relief when we develop new cars to replace the old ones, believing that we've moved past automobility. Okay. The Energy Humanities tries to get us to see the easy and the hard parts of fuels or energy, but especially I think the latter, the harder part, through books, critique, investigations of social practices, and the idea driving our politics. Okay, so just what this means. What does this mean? All right, I'm going to tell you what this means in 3 slides. Okay, you don't have to read this. Actually, you should read this, especially the beginning. So I made it in very big letters. Well, let me just read the first few lines. Motor power places gigantic forces at his disposal, which, like his muscles, he can employ in any direction. Thanks to ships and aircraft, neither water nor air can hinder his movements. By means of his spectacles, he corrects defects in the lens of his own eye. I'll just go on to the end. With the help of the telephone, he can hear distances which would be respected as unattainable even in a fairy tale. Okay, now, I didn't write this. This is, in fact, a quote from Sigmund Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents. Freud discusses here all the ways in which the development of technology allows human beings to become more than their mere bodies. Motor power places gigantic forces at his disposal, he writes, which, like his muscles, he can employ in any direction. Thanks to ships and aircraft, neither water nor air can hinder his movements. All the things he lists, he concludes, would be respected as unattainable even in a fairy tale. Okay, so he's trying to get across that we have bodies, but like in a fairy tale, now we can do these incredible things with our bodies. I moved through the air to get here. Okay, this is now a banal, boring fact. I just say, I flew here. This is an amazing thing. This could not have been done at an earlier moment. This is due to technology. Okay, now, indeed, what Freud says later on, after this quote, is that we're closer to demigods than to people. It's the phrase he uses is prosthetic gods. Okay, we're gods because we have these spectacles. We have this motor power. We're no longer just our bodies, but we can do things which to our ancestors would appear miraculous. The idea that I could just fly here through the air and across the Pacific to come to Taiwan would have been unimaginable, even to my great-grandparents certainly, but even to my grandparents in rural Hungary. When my grandfather flew through the air in the mid-70s, he could not believe this could be done. He thought it was the work of God. So this is from Civilization and Its Discontents. And this is kind of the civilization part that Freud wants to explain. Freud, psychoanalyst, he wants to explain what this does psychologically to us. The discontents part of the title is less often, we less often pay attention to it. And what Freud means is that there's a mismatch between the powers of technology and the limits of the flesh. Despite finding ourselves to be like gods, he says, humans do not feel happy in their godlike character. That's his quote. Energy has done something fundamental to our bodies and our sense of ourselves. We take this to be normal, and we don't even think much about it day to day. This is a graph of world energy consumption by source over time. The one on the left, your left, your left, is taken from estimates from Václav Smil's book, Energy Transitions, together with British Petroleum statistical data. But the reason I put up two graphs there is you can see that other graphs that are put together with different data pretty much map the same trajectory. Freud, in Civilization and Discontents, was writing about humans and their godlike powers in 1930. That book comes out. Before we had really started to use energy in the degree to which we use it now. Today, which is really starting in 1945. So today we use 5 or even 6 times as much energy as we did individually per capita as we did in 1930. I know that when I say that, I know that the energy that we use in different parts of the world is wildly different, the amount of it that we use. Some people use an enormous amount of it, some people use less. But that difference, I think, matters less than what this is telling us about how we change, how we relate to one another, and what we imagine makes a life meaningful and important. We all crave more energy, even if some of us use it less in the world than the rest of us. We all crave more of it because of what it does for us. We all want to be prosthetic gods. The small individual demigods that energy has made us has also made us want more, always more. Adding renewable energies to the mix of fossil fuels has so far just increased the total amount of energy we use on the planet. It has not done a substitution yet, it's just increased the total amount. Energy humanists want us to pay attention to the changes energy has wrought in our character and our ways of being individually and together, what this has meant for our planet and our relations with one another, and what it means about our capacity to reimagine ourselves. In Greek mythology, I looked very hard. In Greek mythology, there are no examples of demigods ever giving up their powers to become just people. There is one example, but I'll tell you. This was one of the first pictures I took when I moved to Edmonton, Alberta, to take the job at the University of Alberta that was mentioned earlier. Yeah, I feel like I'm like teaching a class. I want to go like, do you guys know what this is? Okay, I won't do that. So there's an oil pump jack. There it is there. Not a real oil pump jack, but one that is set up to be in play space for kids to play on. It's erected on the edge of a McDonald's parking lot. Visible just behind the jack are the colorful letters designating the restaurant's play space. Well, off to the left is the globally recognized double arch of the fast food empire sign. In Alberta, where I grew up, the pump jack is not an unfamiliar sight. Okay? Indeed, in my 3-hour drive up from Calgary to Edmonton, during the move, I passed a number of pump jacks off the side of the road, just pumping away. Pump jacks are set up when a drill site has been mostly exhausted of its fuels and it's just there to do its work slowly. So I passed by a number of them. I grew up in Alberta. I didn't really even take notice of it. It seemed normal to me. They were all just pulling oil out of the ground. I didn't think very much about it. But this was the first time I've seen a pump jack, a fake pump jack. It moves around. And it was the first time, too, that I'd seen anything like it near the Golden Arches. There are things that this photo cannot say on its own. This pump jack moves patiently, pretending to carry out the work that it must do, and with a speed approximating the actions of the real thing. It was remarkable to me that it moved, that they spent so much time on this, that it moved in the same way. It looked like the pump jacks I just passed. This McDonald's also, I have to say, it's not hidden away. It's located at the corner of 2 major arteries in Edmonton, one running across the city and the other into and out of it. Thousands of commuters use both of these daily, as do visitors rushing from the airport into the core of the city. If you come from the airport to the core, you must pass this. In an otherwise drab and ugly part of Edmonton, made up of little more than chain stores and light industrial parks, this pump jack stands out, a strange sentinel. Its very existence seems to insist on its importance. What this photo also can say is that Alberta is a province that has tied its identity determinately to oil. The continued life of oil extraction has come to be viewed by many in the province as an economic necessity, even if it exposes it to the vagaries of oil prices and overstates the actual number of jobs in the industry. The industry and the government will say, this province depends enormously on the jobs. There are actually very few people working in the industry because of technology like the oil pumps. The presence of the pump jack at this McDonald's is also a symbol of the complex politics that troubles and unnerves environmental and political change in Canada, something I'll talk about some more in the third section. Its predictable place in the Alberta landscape and its strangely comforting presence next to a child's playground acts as a weight on the present, making it very difficult to imagine any real movement of the province and the nation into a renewable future. So this pump jack has a lot to do with the ways in which energy can matter in contemporary politics today, which goes beyond who controls it, or the price at the pump, or wars over oil, though those matter as well. To me, it explains some of the fantasies and beliefs that accompany what fossil fuel means for communities, workers, cities, places, and why it matters for where one lives and who one is. Albertans have come to see their identities as linked to this dirty stuff of the earth that is threatening to make the planet uninhabitable. So what are the energy humanities? I'm just going to offer a quick sketch of the different ways in which we stand in relation to energy, the hard parts, if you remember, the kinds of issues I've been trying to draw your attention to through these three very, very different slides. I'm going to try to talk to you about energy and some of the issues that researchers in the energy humanities are intrigued by. But just what are the energy humanities? So over the past 13 years, the interdisciplinary study of energy humanities has emerged to explore social, cultural, and political questions related to energy. If there's a unifying assertion or insight that ties the field together, it is the claim that there's a deep link between energy, the energy on which a society depends, and the character of its cultural, social, and political forms. To put this directly, far from being just a neutral input into any society, energy plays an essential role for shaping who we are and how and where we live, which the examples I've just described should give you some sense of. The history and shape of the modern era is deeply connected not just to having a lot of energy, but the character of energy that has been dominant over the past 175 years, fossil fuels, and the world it has created. Since the mid-19th century, changes in the forms of energy that we employ have significantly altered what we're capable of, how we imagine ourselves, and the spaces we inhabit. The structure of transportation systems, the overall shape and design of cities, and the expansion of global trade are linked to the ease of access and affordability of fossil fuels, which has created durable structures such as refineries and highways that will have to be repurposed in a post-oil future, a future that will be extremely challenging to achieve. Much of the psychological, affective, and political characteristics of modernity, which again, let me just speak to them, individuality, autonomy, self-development, the sense of freedom we have as individuals. All of these, I will assert, or energy humanists also want to assert, or want to at least investigate, they're connected to having a lot of energy. And they're also connected to the spaces and politics and capacities that energy has produced. This is especially the case since the Second World War. If you saw those graphs I showed you, a period that has been described as the Great Acceleration by some scholars and as the Great Derangement by others. The energy humanities does not claim there's a one-way cause and effect between a relationship between the expanded per capita energy use enabled by fossil fuels and the socio-spatial developments that characterize modernity. The relationship is dialectical. Okay? As it develops, that form further develops the kind of energy and the way we use energy. The advent of cheap and and accessible sources of energy, this is coming out weird, helped to generate new forms of technology, infrastructure, and social behavior, which in turn led to an ever greater use of fossil fuels in a process that some scholars have termed energy deepening. As Jean-Claude Debier, Jean-Paul Deleage, and Daniel Emery argue in their iconic early history of energy from 1991, which is really, I think, kind of a precursor to energy humanities as it has developed in the Anglophone academic community. While there's no energy determinism, there's a powerful energy determination at work in all societies. The energy determination is itself determined. It is the result of the interplay of economic, demographic, psychological, intellectual, social, and political parameters operating in the various human societies. It's a very important distinction. Determinism would mean that it has to have a certain kind of outcome. It's necessary because of the fuel that we use. This is not quite that. It's saying there's a determination. It shapes something. It makes it. And then what happens is there's a flowback effect. That determination is itself determined. The process of a century and a half of energy deepening with fossil fuels, a continuous doubling down of social bets on this substance, makes it very difficult to imagine easy turning off of the taps. If it were somehow possible to switch immediately from fossil fuels to, say, solar energy, much of global society would nevertheless remain a fossil fuel society, thanks in large part to the inertia of its material, political, and social infrastructures. Car-dependent suburbs cannot be quickly retrofitted for a walkable density, nor can oil refineries easily be converted to other uses, nor could you imagine that that pump jack in Alberta in the McDonald's parking lot would ever be suddenly replaced by solar panels. Okay. I think this is pretty much the kind of key point here. So let me kind of try to push this forward a bit. We're a fossil fuel society. Changing the input, the fuel input, doesn't change the ways in which we have developed ourselves around fossil fuels. Some of that is infrastructural. We will still have the highways that we have. We still have the city spaces as they're organized. We still have suburbs. But it also is the desires that come with that. We still want the suburbs, or large numbers of people want the suburbs. We still want to move on highways individually. Right? I know this is different in different parts of the world, but I can just tell you about what this looks like in Toronto. In Toronto, there's a high occupancy vehicle lane on highways. That means if you have, in Toronto, what that means is if you have 2 or more people, you can travel in this lane as opposed to the regular highway, which is the second busiest highway in the world. If you drive on the highway, if you try to, the high occupancy vehicle lane will be empty. Why? First of all, because Canadians are much too, honest. But the other reason is because cars are about individual mobility. They're about moving where you want to go. That's why the EV is such a fantasy for the world. You still get to move how you want to go, but the type of movement you do and the spaces you move in and the infrastructure you move in is still a fossil fuel infrastructure. So this is part of what energy humanists are really struggling with, to draw attention to all those kinds of places of determination. And to do that, part of the kind of the politics of it is to then think about how to make renewable societies that really fit with these new forms of renewable energies. Our French progenitors remind us that a true transition would require a radical change in key economic choices which shape civilization over long periods. What is required is a decisive broadening of political and social democracy, a profound change in individual behavior and educational systems. In other words, true energy transition, and we acknowledge that the demand for energy transition may be a demand for a process that has not yet happened in history, but a true energy transition requires something akin to a political revolution. a new articulation of the commons to undergird and support the introduction of solar panels, electric transport, and sustainable configurations of space. It isn't necessarily a political revolution. It will feel like it, or it has to be, or it has to have that level of change. The intervention of the energy humanities that we have begun to describe, which takes energy seriously as more than an interchangeable material input, can be broken down into two components. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to really explain what this is, but I think you'll get it. So two components that I think captures the bulk of what the energy humanities scholarship is about. One is analytic and conceptual, and the other is speculative and political. One is kind of standard academic research. You could have history, you could have what I've been talking to you about. You can have investigations of how freedom is connected to use of a lot of energy. And then you have this other part, which is speculative. It's about, well, how else might we be? What does it look like to have a renewable society? How do we enact, using this information, a different kind of politics, not just about energy, but about our ideas about the very big picture issues in our lives. So with respect to this first one, the fundamental goal of the energy humanities is to argue for the need to include energy in accounts that the human sciences offer of any subject whatsoever, with an emphasis on the history of modernity, the period during which rapid increases in energy use transformed human life experience. Accounts that foreground energy have already begun to re-narrate our understanding of key moments in the development of contemporary culture, society, and politics, as well as the spaces that shape them. The work of historian and political theorist Timothy Mitchell stands out as one of the early and most powerful examples of this approach. In Carbon Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil, an incredibly impactful and influential text, Mitchell connects, among other things, the shift from coal to oil as having a major impact on unions. As forms of energy moved by pipeline become dominant over coal, the capacity of unions to shut down energy flows from coal mines declined. So just to be clear about this, the coal miners are able to shut down the coal mine because of how you move coal, of how coal moves. Right? You just stand in front of the mine shaft, okay? Because you need to physically move that stuff around. It produces or it influences unionism and the politics, the deep politics of unionism. Mitchell argued there have been criticisms of this, but as soon as you have a pipeline, you can't stand in front of a pipeline. The pipeline moves. The pipeline, he would suggest, has undercut political movements. The pipeline, you can blow up the pipeline, but generally most of us don't know where a pipeline is. Okay, just because I'm an energy nerd, I can usually tell you where a pipeline is in your community. I would be curious if any of you knew where a pipeline was here in Taipei. I don't know where they are in Taipei. I'm not that much of a nerd. So the bigger takeaway from Mitchell's influential book, though, is kind of what I've been intimating here, is the growing reliance on oil for energy and the emergence of what might be described as democratic governmentality. That is, a form of governing that divides the commons to limit claims for greater equalities and justice. This governmentality consigns particular concerns to distinct spheres, such as to nature or the private sphere, that are subject to specific rules that limit certain kinds of political claims. One of these claims is the claim over the right to construct fossil fuel infrastructure, and to do so largely in relationship to the imperatives of government and business. And maybe that was a little bit complicated, so let me put it this way. We all think that water is a good that should be shared by everybody. We don't think that about fuel. How did that happen? It comes from the earth. We all benefit from it. Why did that become privatized? Some of it has to do with this history around unionism. All right. Like Mitchell, the work of Swedish historian Andreas Malm provides a reimagining of another key moment in the history of the present. The Industrial Revolution is often seen as a period in which liberal political ideology and technological advances improved the lot of humanity. A development signaled, at least this is the common story, in the switch from water mills to more efficient and powerful factories and engines run on coal, and then ones run on petroleum. That's the history that we have of the world. Water mills are inefficient. They move to coal, and then they move to fuel. Now, what Malm argues is that the transition from water to steam, water power, form of water mills, to steam was actually a form of class warfare. Coal turns out not to have been cheaper than water. The reason that water mills were given up was not because coal was a better technology, but because it was more mobile. You could put factories wherever you wanted them. You could concentrate them. You could move the coal to the factories. That's what caused urbanization to happen in the United Kingdom. And that allowed you to exploit unspecialized workers, usually women and children, to work in your factories. The problem, again, with the people working at the water mills, smaller villages, is that they could just decide not to work on any given day. Sometimes your water didn't run, and you had to have your factory next to them. That gets suddenly changed in an enormous way, changes how unionization works, changes the ways in which laborers could be exploited, changes which laborers could be exploited. Other analyses have produced similar insights into the character of the present, including Amitav Ghosh's account of the inability of the modern novel to address climate change, and Dipesh Chakrabarty's reframing of the terms on which historical research is carried out in light of the global warming, and Kara Daggett's argument linking the management of labor to the very concept of the birth of energy. In a forthcoming essay, I extend these insights to the formation of modern subjectivity itself, noting that the modern subject is a fossil fuel subject and thereby rendering the history of energy and the project of climate politics into ontological terms. That's the analytic and conceptual. Often it takes the form of history, re-narrating history by adding energy back into it, which changes fundamentally the forces that produced the outcomes that we already know that are there, changing how we imagine that history, changing the forces of that history. So in addition to this, we have this other part, which I can really only say very, very briefly, which is the speculative and political dimensions, which I think are equally important, but less stressed, I think. The absence of energy from our accounts of modernity has impoverished our understanding of it and limited our sense of the forces and imaginary shaping the present, including the role of petrocultures and infrastructures in shaping perception. It's also made it difficult to respond effectively to one of the consequences of intense fossil fuel use, which is the production of increasing levels of carbon dioxide. The analytic work of the energy humanities produces an expanded vision of the social and infrastructural commitments that have been made to fossil fuels. But when it comes to energy use, it's not simply enough to generate knowledge or insight into processes or protocols. It is vital to develop political responses at the right scale and the optimal sites in order to begin unraveling the tightly coiled temporality of energy deepening. If I had to just kind of summarize there a bit, it's not enough for energy humanities to give you a different account of history, to complicate history, to undercut the idea that technology is driving progress. There has to be this next part, which is, now what do we do with this knowledge? How do we activate it? How do we change the narrative, especially on what we do about climate change? How do we change the narrative on some of the things that were said in the introduction, on who controls renewables? Why do we put them into place? What does it matter? How does it fit with the priorities of governments, what it means for communities as well? Just to give you a quick, very, very quick sense of this, over the past few years, the energy humanities has grown at an incredible pace. People are writing across history, geography, and method, looking at how energy shapes everything from political order and modern subjectivity to art, infrastructure, and everyday life. There's work on the cultural histories of coal, oil, and electricity, but also on the new imaginaries of wind, solar, and nuclear power. Scholars are thinking about energy alongside race, gender, and sexuality, about indigenous sovereignty and decolonization, about the aesthetics and politics of extraction, logistics, and repair. Others have turned the lens back on the field itself, asking what kinds of knowledge and values are made possible through ideas like petrocultures, energopolitics, and solarities. Taken all together, this work spans history, ethnography, theory, and the arts, but it shares one conviction: that energy isn't just the backdrop to social life, it's the medium that organizes our economies, our emotions, and our futures. And just as a quick aside, as of this fall, there will be a journal dedicated to the energy humanities, which will be published by Open Humanities Press. All right, that's 2 parts down. You only got 1 part to go. The title of this talk was, Why Do the Energy Humanities Matter Now? So I'm going to give you, I think I gave you some senses of that. I'm going to give you one of the ways it matters now. I'm going to talk about the ideological functions of energy today, and the role it plays in some forms of populism and fascism. Okay. You don't need to have energy to have populism and fascism. It seems to be the case that at the moment, it matters a lot for populism and fascism. We can talk about the difference. There is a difference, I think, but it matters in some cases. Energy seems to matter, and specific forms of energy matter. And that, to me, is confusing and interesting and tells me a lot about the nature of the fantasies that guide politics in certain places. All right, so on January 20th, wait, what was that? Oh yeah, okay. On January 20th, 2025, as wildfires ripped through 90 square miles of land in and around Los Angeles, California, Donald Trump delivered his second inaugural address, in which he announced that he would sign a series of executive orders to begin quote, to begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense. Very important word, common sense. After first declaring a national emergency at the southern border, Trump, so this is the second thing he talked about, Trump proposed to address inflation by declaring a national energy emergency. Okay. No lack of energy in the US. So what is this energy emergency? America, he said, will be a manufacturing nation once again, and we have something no other manufacturing nation will ever have: the largest amount of oil and gas of any country on earth, and we are going to use it. We will use it. We will be a rich nation again, and it is the liquid gold under our feet that will help us to do it. In the year since January, Trump has often railed against renewable energy, calling it a scam and a con, while raising tariffs under the auspices of bringing manly manufacturing back to the United States. Indeed, the fixation of America's empowered and emboldened right wing on undoing green energy development, undermining climate science, and restoring fossil-fueled abundance exemplifies, I think, gives you an example of energy's cultural and historical and political force. Energy is in part about being an American man. It's about older America, an older America, in which women stayed at home while men went off to use their bodies in the coal mines. It's a vision of a white, heterosexual America, free of immigrants, in which, in Trump's words, common sense has been restored. Trump's interest in there's a joke in here, some of you might know it. Anyway, Trump's interest in oil and coal isn't what they do for the economy. That's not his interest in oil and coal. If he wants mines to stay open, even if those who own the mines don't want to do this, they see it as a losing proposition, but he insists on keeping the mines open, it is because it represents a vision of America essential to the Make America Great movement and its political fantasies. So here we have this sense. Why does energy matter that much? It symbolizes so much more than just Brent oil crude price. It's about a vision of power of America. It's about why there is the war in Iran. It isn't about geopolitical strategizing. There's no strategizing. It's a disaster. So it's something very different. It's about a fantasy of political strength. It's about an idea that a certain kind of America has about what America once was and what it has lost. That narrative is very important to it. And this gets played out through energy in complicated and very strange ways. So I said this word common sense. There are present a number of different visions of energy pasts and futures, fighting it out to see how the energy world looks like and what the people and societies in it look like too. And the way any one of these narratives come to define the politics of the post-fossil fuel era will depend on its success at becoming the norm against which others are forced to measure themselves. In essence, we can see each as struggling to transform itself in the undisputed common sense about how to approach energy transition and climate change. And when I use that word climate sense, I mean it in the terms defined by cultural studies scholars Stuart Hall and Alan O'Shea, who describe it as comprising, quote, frameworks of meaning with which to make sense of the world. Appeals to common sense are a way of bringing people into one's narrative fold, an almost effortless way of defining an us versus a them. Right? Those who recognize the right way of doing things and those who hold extreme or critical views or who just don't get it. Each of the narratives of renewables that I've been talking about, each of the narratives around energy, especially the contrast between the Trumpian one and the vision of a certain kind of renewable energy, is a way of trying to determine the common sense of the energy future, and then also all of the sort of sets of ideas that connect up with that future. So just to give you a sense of how this common sense is played out in different ways, I'm going to end by talking not about the United States, which is almost a self-parody, an easy one to joke about, just to show you that this sense of common sense is a very real one. It's activated in many places. Common sense is done on the side of every possible political angle right now, all of them trying to assert a definition of something in the process of either being defined or falling apart. This is a very common word in politics, but it seems to have returned with a special force and often in connection with energy that I've seen. The US can be a self-parody on this in terms of the degree to which there is this insistence on energy that even the market doesn't believe in. If you recall, after Maduro was, I don't know how to say it, kidnapped in Venezuela, and the kingpins of the oil industry were summoned by Trump to say, here you go ahead and extract. They were uninterested. Just as too difficult to extract. They didn't believe they could make money. And he couldn't believe they wouldn't purchase the narrative of it, less than the money, right? But this just isn't in the United States. This is true in a friendly, kind, beautiful place like Canada. This is a part of the book Futures of the Sun, which you probably know less about. And there too, in a very confusing way, right-wing politicians and people on the right wing have fused fossil fuel dependency with libertarian freedoms, conspiracy theories, and nationalist narratives. As you'll see, discussions about what kind of energy we use go way beyond how much carbon dioxide gets produced. So here we go. That's the third section. The shape of contemporary politics of fossil fuel in Canada is the outcome of an extended history of governmental conflict over extraction, which has, over that period, it has made the Canadian right connected to oil in a way that now would be very hard to shake. The origin of the enmity between the province of Alberta and Canada has a longer history, but the real current struggles extend back to the National Energy Program in the 1980s, in which the Canadian federal government tried to effectively, let's just say, nationalize aspects of the industry. And they did so in order to try to respond to the after effects of the 1973 oil crisis in Canada. So there was incredible opposition to this in Western Canada, led by the government and the oil industry, which helped to bring about its end in 1985. A popular bumper sticker at the time, which I remember from my youth, said, "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark." A sentiment that remains in place up to the present and is kept alive by industry and government in Alberta, usually working together. The perceived overreach of the government on resource control was also the impetus behind the creation of a far-right Canadian party that took over the Conservatives. So now we don't really have a Canadian Conservative Party of old. We have a Conservative Party that's made up of the Canadian Alliance and Reform parties. Really and truly, they are oil parties. To claim that the desire to control resources is the only thing behind right-wing populism in Canada is definitely an overstatement. But to claim that there isn't a deep connection between the two would be to miss why it's so important for the right in Canada to affirm resource extraction as an important element of Alberta's heritage, of Canadian heritage, which it has to defend all the time from those who might seek to end it. Let me just put that a different way. You can have a right wing in Canada without energy, but it definitely is the case that is connected to energy. You can have a right wing that has nothing to do with energy. You can have a right wing that's interested in renewables, but in this case, that's not how energy is playing out. In Hungary, there's no oil, so there the government has no interest in energy at all. It doesn't play out a certain kind of fantasy of an older Hungary, which is so important to the functioning of that government via energy. But you see, at least in the US and in Canada, that is the case, and I could point to some other things too. So I could point, maybe I'll move a little faster here, but so there's a number of places where you have this government-industry connection, where they're trying to play out and continue to keep this linkage going. So one of them is this public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaign put on by the government of Alberta, where it's a long, several-year inquiry where they're trying to look at whether or not NGOs and advocacy organizations like Greenpeace Canada were being funded. Basically, it was looking at whether they were kind of terrorist organizations, frankly, and looking at whether they were funded by foreign interests, and those foreign interests were wanting to take down energy and therefore take apart Canadian democracy. The second is this Pathways Alliance, which is made up of let us clear the air, right? Of 6 companies, which are these 6 companies together operate 95% of oil extraction in Canada. So if you go to this website, you'll see that this company adapts the language of the Paris Agreement to explain how it intends to achieve net zero. The now standard language of environmental goals to be achieved and commitments to be made to social-political issues, like there's a land acknowledgement on every single page of the website. It almost buries the lead. Industry hopes to get to net zero. They're very committed to net zero, not by reducing or eliminating extraction, but by using new technologies such as carbon capture and storage to manage its greenhouse gas production. So the supposed commitment of the fossil fuel industry to the Paris Agreement is just one approach to get Canadians to remain committed to extraction. Another has been to insist on the specific social and political importance and character of Canadian oil. And so this is this campaign now quite an extended campaign launched by industry and government to explain that oil sands matters because it's Canadian. Oil sands matters because it's Canadian. There's at least two stages to this. So the first is captured in Ezra Levant's 2010 book, Ethical Oil. The argument here is simple. Fossil fuels are still necessary. Most countries don't produce enough, but they have to get it from somewhere. Okay, so most fossil fuels are produced in petrostates with poor human rights records and led by totalitarian governments. By contrast, Canada produces ethical oil because it originates in a first world democratic country known for being a global leader on human rights. In opposition to environmentalists who want to limit or stop oil, Levant writes, the question is not whether we should use sands oil instead of some perfect fantasy fuel that hasn't been invented. Until that miracle fuel is invented, the question is whether we should use oil from the oil sands or oil from other places in the world that pump it. Okay, so in the years following this book, I know everybody kind of a little chuckle. This term ethical oil was employed by industry to reinforce the legitimacy of continued extraction. Until the term faded from use, it's actually returned post the election of Mark Carney. Once again, this term is being used quite commonly. So there's one other stage in between, and that was in 2018, when the idea of ethical oil was revived by a group called Ontario Proud, which is not based in Ontario, and guess who backs it? It's a right-wing group committed to returning power to the people. And in a series of ads via its website, Stop Saudi Oil, it produces a message perfectly suited for the Trump era. These posters here, which show people, here's like a rainbow flags, ethical oil, pride. Here's people who are terrorists, persecution. Here's people, reforestation. So I was sitting and having a coffee at a place I used to work at a lot in Toronto, and Toronto has streetcars. A streetcar went by. I usually show this photo. The entire streetcar was covered with an ad that had this kind of thing on it. This goes on. There was a Raise Your Hand for Canada campaign that shows pictures of mostly white Canadians holding a hand up, fingers spread, over which is pasted the outline of a maple leaf. The concluding line of the ad says, "Think energy developed the Canadian way is good for Canada." Okay, so yeah, if you do, then the time is now to raise your hand. Say so by raising your hand. The latest campaign to marry Canadian values with oil was initiated in the wake of the war in Ukraine. Kind of combines that ethical oil language again with some of these kinds of things. Here's another thing. Made the Canadian way, this website says, if your oil and gas came with a label, what would you learn? The label posted online tells us that oil and gas are innovation-driven and responsibly produced. This campaign was mounted by the Canadian Energy Centre, which was created by the government of Alberta to support industry in whatever way possible. This is giving a really bad image of Canada, I know. So what's the takeaway here? Are we supposed to understand fossil fuel as a good belonging to all Canadians, as industry ad campaigns suggest, or to Albertans alone, which is the standpoint of the government? Okay, it does both things. Sometimes it's all Canadians, sometimes it's just Alberta, sometimes it's Alberta fights with Canadians. It's meant to be this kind of confusing back and forth, with the issue being that this is central to the politics that is playing out. Now, just going on here, so the confusing thing in all of this is that, and the message always is that the Canadian public owns oil, when it is in fact owned by private industry. There's this notion again that it's the federal government owns it, raise your hand for Canada, but then the federal government is taking it from Alberta. This has been an incredibly effective, this confusing mess of ideas about national belonging has been incredibly effective common sense to change the dominant energy system in Canada. It's made it very hard to get past this energy system that most people in Canada, the majority, believes is bad for the environment. This common sense is filled with contradictions, with oppositions that can flip-flop, but no matter what, it's shown that renewables over and over again is trying to say renewables are a threat. It's a threat to the state, it's a threat to the economy, it's a threat to ethical oil. Ethical oil will disappear unless there's more extraction. So the result in Canada has been that the xenophobia of right-wing populisms has been shaped not by exclusions that defined by race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, or not those primarily, or at least not only those, but by differences with respect to energy sources, which is a unique political configuration with serious consequences for energy transition and climate action. So I just want to add one more thing to this to give you a sense of how much this is being played out. So far, I think you will agree that this is not just about the fuel you put in your gas tank. This is a lot of other things are being played out here. And this might be something that you did hear about, which is the month-long Freedom Convoy, which made its way across Canada before reaching Ottawa on January 29th, 2021, which mobilized the center periphery nations around extraction to new ends. These truckers occupied Ottawa in and around Parliament Hill for a month. And the supposed origin of this was that some truckers tried to get into the US. They didn't want to be vaccinated and they weren't allowed in. And then to show their displeasure at that, so this is a US mandate, a small minority of them decided to vent their frustrations against the Canadian government, which I don't know what had anything to do with it, but it doesn't matter. So the protest was about 8,000 people to begin with, and it started to drop over time, but it was there for an entire month. And the only way to dislodge them was the imposition of the Emergencies Act, which is something that the Canadian federal government has only ever used once before, which allowed the federal government to deal with emergencies it views as threats to the country's sovereignty and security. But this convoy had a real impact. It offered, I think, an X-ray about the contemporary state of Canadian political life. Governments were frightened to get involved. These people came there. The Ottawa police did not want to get involved. The Ontario provincial police did not want to get involved to move them. The Canadian military did not want to get involved. The Royal Canadian Military Police did not want to get involved. They left them there on Parliament Hill. They left them there blocking downtown Ottawa. It started by these people went there and they demanded the end of the vaccine mandate, but almost immediately it turned into a demand about oil. Now, maybe this could be seen as a general frustration against a government unwilling or unable to address the concerns of ordinary Canadians. When the demands of the convoy were, when they asked the leaders like what the demands were, one of the leaders said, "It's everything." Okay, but it kind of it was also kind of connected up with a familiar Western separatist ideology, even though most of the truckers were from Ontario, in Eastern Canada. And it turned out that a lot of the funding for this controversy came from the United States. Some of the conspiracies came from QAnon and from a range of right-wing US-based groups. And the protest turned into a protest from vaccines to fossil fuels. So the quick abandonment of the plight of unvaccinated truckers, that's where it started, they made demands for the Governor General to dissolve the government, which he cannot do until the government has lost the confidence of the House of Parliament. So you get this kind of confusing situation once again that they're saying the government should dissolve, and they demand the government dissolve themselves, which is a little bit bizarre. But the politics of fossil fuels can be seen as really linked to this Freedom Convoy. The Freedom Convoy built on the lessons of an earlier trucker convoy. It's not all we do in Canada. We don't just have trucker convoys. But in February 2019, let me see if I can get this here. Yes, another trucker convoy brought thousands of truckers to Ottawa to protest the federal government's introduction of a carbon tax and the development of strengthened environmental assessments of energy projects, as well as its ban on oil tankers on the northern coast of British Columbia. Some of those at the 2019 protests were also there to express their displeasure at the drop in oil prices, and that means the drop in profits, which is a bizarre demand. I mean, they had this sense that the Canadian government was the one that sets the rate on oil prices, and they wanted the Canadian government to somehow increase the sale price of the West Texas Intermediate or Brent crude to make sure that people who were in the convoy could make money still. United We Roll was Canada's own version of the Gilets Jaunes protest, which saw Canadian yellow-vested Canadians protesting simultaneously against greenhouse gas policies and cultural threats posed by Muslims, immigrants, and the LGBTQ community. There have been calls recently for another convoy, this one to protest a 30% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. Once again, this has been refigured by the alt-right media in various kinds of ways. So I think what you can kind of get here is that the importance of oil for life in Canada is affirmed in the very form taken by this Freedom Convoy, a protest which is built out of trucks and saturated by the petromasculinity and petropopulism connected with convoys ever since the release of the 1978 film of the same name. The confusing landscape of popular politics I've just painted isn't unique to Canada, as you could see from the comments I made at the beginning with respect to the beginning of the section with respect to the US, even if the degree to which the right has connected it with the oil industry might be. In his 1995 essay, Fascism, Umberto Eco, the writer and critic, argues that fascism is grounded in a cult of tradition, but a tradition that is syncretistic, a combination of different forms of belief and practice that, quote unquote, must tolerate contradiction. In Canada, fossil fuels have shaped right-wing notions of tradition that have proven able to easily navigate such contradictions. The implications of the right's political syncretism are obvious. Nothing needs to be done with the natural world as long as it remains the place where money magically flows from the ground. To do anything about climate change is to be both anti-Canadian and dangerously opposed to tradition. What this analysis ultimately shows, I hope, is that energy is not simply a technical problem to be solved through better engineering or more efficient technologies. It's a problem of meaning, power, and imagination. The way we understand energy, what it is for, who it belongs to, and what kinds of lives it makes possible are shaped by history, culture, and politics as much as by science. If we want to understand why fossil fuels persist, why transitions stall, or why certain futures feel possible while others do not, we need the tools of the humanities and the qualitative social sciences, the quantitative ones as well, why not? These fields help us see how energy is woven into the identities, institutions, and forms of common sense that cannot be changed by policy alone. For this reason, the humanities are not an optional supplement to energy research. They are essential to it. They allow us to grasp the deeper attachment narratives that sustain existing systems, as well as the possibilities for imagining alternatives. As the examples discussed here in these three sections suggest, energy shapes I'll insist again, not only our infrastructures and economies, but our values, our sense of selves, our political horizons. Any meaningful transition, energy transition, will therefore depend not only on new technologies, but on new ways of thinking, interpreting, and living with energy in the world. Thanks.
Certainly we now have a big picture of what energy humanity is. So now, let's invite the贝格泰for the comments and the talk, please.
Thank you very much, and I have to also thank Professor Lee and Taida for inviting me to serve as commentator for Professor Szeman's talk, which is an incredible honor. I mean, you heard it earlier, but Professor Szeman is one of the scholars who were instrumental in establishing the energy humanities as a distinctive field. And for me, as somebody who comes from the environmental humanities, I think this is like one of the most important intellectual revolutions that took place in over the last 10, 15 years. So I'm very, very honored to be here today. And thank you very much for this wonderful talk, introducing this absolutely crucial this set of ideas to our students and to our colleagues. I have so many comments and questions in my head, but I want to start with something that looks to me like a tension between the starting point of your talk and where you ended up. Because you opened with this wonderful quotation from Sigmund Freud, where he talks about the prosthetic God. Of course, in German, it's a compound noun, Prothesengott. And you said, in a sense, the measure of the political the difficulty of the task that we're facing. You made this sort of offhand remark, can you think of any Greek myth in which a god voluntarily gives up their divine powers? And which of course implied that what we need to do is incredibly hard, if not impossible, probably impossible. Although I should note that, maybe not in classical myth, but the whole Christian mythology is built on the myth of a god who gives up his divine powers. But then, in a sense, and you also had this wonderful graph that shows that, in a sense, the whole notion of an energy transition is in some way profoundly misleading, because we never transitioned away from anything. It's always been additive. I mean, like, the whole point of the graph is we didn't transition away from coal. We're using more coal than we ever did in the history, right? Everything except for nuclear power, which has kind of like a dent in it, but that's probably going to go up again as well now. That in a way, this whole talk of an energy transition, the whole idea that we can kind of hold on to our lifestyle and just replace everything with solar panels and wind turbines and EVs, and then we'll be okay. We don't have to think too much about it. That is a fantasy, and actually a dangerous fantasy. But I think, which I think is a very sobering thought, but I think I would think true, undisputably true. Whereas at the end of the talk, you were kind of mostly talking about this sort of right-wing reaction against the attempt. I mean, it's actually, you might say, it's one kind of fantasy politics against another kind of fantasy politics, right? That in a way, what these right-wing populists, fossil fuel populists, were invading or raging against is itself no less delusional than what they were advocating. And so, yeah, what do we do then? if the choice is between two delusional politics, and isn't the problem maybe at some level, and I'm going to have to kind of cut myself short here, but I mean, at some level, ultimately, what I would kind of draw from the opening of your talk is that what will be required is that we actually cut back energy use. We actually reduce the amount of energy that we use, which is something that is, and probably, I don't know whether that is possible to sell that within democratic politics. If that's your goal, you're going to lose at the polls. I think there's just no democracy or no modern sort of capitalist consumer democracy that we have. Within that set of circumstances, this is not a policy that can fly. Yeah, I don't know. That was kind of more comment, half comment.
No, that's great. That's really, really great. That's really, really great. Okay, so let me try to take this part. Those you made some excellent points. So what I would say, there is, I'm trying to remember, there's one example of a demigod in Greek mythology. Let me leave the Christian part aside. Giving up their powers, and they give it up for love. Okay, so that's corny, but I'll just put that out there. The point of what energy transition is about, because there have been recent critiques of this concept, except by several people, including a French historian, Jean-Baptiste Frézeau, is that there's no transition. There's never been a transition. There's only been something called energy deepening. And I think he misunderstands what is useful about that term. When it's used in a technical fashion, which is how you will mostly read about it, it doesn't work out. Okay, you still have more and more energy being added. What you might have is the mix changing. You might have the mix changing, and I do think it is changing. But you might not have the total amount declining. Some of that has to do with population growth. Some of that has to do with development. So as I said, people want to use more energy. That's what the development is very closely linked to, having more energy. The sense of being developed, the sense of being modern. So it's not the reality of it, it's the project of it. So energy transition is a political project. It names what needs to be done if we are to have the outcome we desire, right? So the outcome is addressing climate change in a fundamental fashion. So if that's not the outcome, then none of this matters. Like, so if fossil fuels didn't produce CO2, then one could say that there's ways you could critique this too. It's kind of like, let's use as much energy as possible. Let's go crazy. Let's use as much, there's no problem. So, but there's a problem because of the amount and the type. So the transition is a project about, let's just say, to begin with, about type. And then I do think it has to be about amount. And it has to be about amount. And it has to be about whether we're okay with intermittent energy. That means having a lot of energy at some points and having less at another point. At least potentially it has to be that. So it's a project. It's to me the political project as opposed to climate change, really. There are peaks. I think in 2024 is when the amount of fossil fuels used peaked. Coal was more recently. And this is a threat to some people. And that's where we come to the second part. So the threat is not just that you're losing out if you are a company. You're not going to make the same profits that you make. Fossil fuel companies, coal companies are actually they're capitalists, so they can read the writing on the wall, right? They know it's coming. The idea is that there's some threat to a way of life and fantasies that go around it. So that's why you get it connected to this populism, as you correctly say. So it is linked to the energy transition as a project that carries with it certain kinds of political implications, or at least that's what seems to be the case. So when commentators often will say, I don't understand why the second thing Trump said in inauguration is drill, baby, drill. Second thing, why does he care? Like, look at Texas. 70% of Texas electrical system is now renewables. Texas doesn't seem to care. It's not part of their project. But it's very clearly part of his project. It's part of a reactionary project. It's connected to whiteness. It's connected to a whole world. And there's something that creeps him and others out about what they think a renewable society looks like, which be very curious for him to draw. I don't know why this came into my head, to draw with a crayon what that would look like. I don't know what that looks like. I think he imagines it as counterculture. I think he imagines it as hippiedom, some of the things we were talking about today in another lecture. So I don't know if that answers those two things. So that's how I see those things as linked. So it's about the question of it being the capacity of current systems to produce that either the change in any concrete and fast fashion, or the drawdown is incredibly hard to see. The only way that could happen is if this politics of common sense was played out in that direction. Like, that's the only way. That makes sense. It's not a big deal. Like, how could it possibly matter? There'll be lots of energy. It'll just look different. Something like that. So I am always nervous about the idea that I don't think you were saying this, but there's no capacity of a system to do something, and so therefore we just let it be the way it is, or we're all doomed. The project is a difficult one. The project is an immensely difficult one. But the fact that there is a change in the composition of energy systems, and one that has happened quite quickly, I would say, in my sense. If I gave this lecture 20 years ago, I would say we're doomed. It seems to be the case that because of cost, at least, this has become possible. The cheapness of renewables has its own problems, but we'll leave that aside. So I kind of see them as the political project of energy transition, whether or not it's happening, it exists as a project, and that's something that did not exist 20 years ago. It comes across as a threat. So it doesn't necessarily fit with what's the numbers say, but it's a project.
I'm really intrigued by what you just said, that, if you had given the talk 20 years ago, you would have been more pessimistic than now. That in a sense, that was one of the things that I was thinking about, what am I going to ask him? And one thing I was thinking about asking you is, in preparing for this, I looked again at the introduction to the anthology that you edited with Dominic Boyer 10 years ago. And I was thinking, like, what has changed since then? What has changed? Like, how did changes in the world kind of affect the way in which you think of these problems as compared to 10 years ago? And one thing that certainly struck me is exactly like, how pessimistic people were 10 years ago. And then it turns out that solar power is now actually in many ways cheaper and more fungible than oil is, which makes this whole spectacle of sort of superpower self-immolation that we're seeing with Trump even more bizarre. That what this project is completely untethered from geopolitical realities, right? That it's really just this thing, this weird meme fight that's going on there in a way, right? But at the same time, this development of renewables becoming so cheap, doesn't that kind of question or at least, put into question one of the premises that of the energy humanities with which you started, which is, of course, we have to say as humanists, it's not just a technical or science problem, it's also culture, it's imagination, because that's what we're responsible for. So, but clearly, what really has made the difference is science and engineering. The fact that this stuff, and I remember I gave a talk about, before, in the run-up to the US election, I was asked to give a talk about, like, what are the ecological implications of if Trump wins or loses, what's really at stake. And in looking at the numbers, the striking thing was his presidency didn't matter the first time around. He was talking about coal, the coal mine kept going down. Like all the trends continued exactly as they would, no matter whether it was Biden or Trump. I mean, it might be different this time around if they actually spend $1 billion to stop people from building windmills, which is so incredible. But I mean, the question is like, isn't it, and of course also the kind of politics that you're describing as right-wing fossil populism is something that I think to people in most Asian countries will be completely alien. It's like a weird vision of masculinity, a weird vision of that being tied into driving cars. It's like, it makes no sense if you live in Taipei, you know? Which means that this is in a way very, very provincial. And the fact that it hasn't been politicized in the same way, that the fact, okay, the energy transition is not, we want to sell you a different new kind of lifestyle. We're just giving it's a better technology. That might be the, you know, I'm being the agent provocateur here, but couldn't one say that the project of the energy humanities in that sense is kind of misconceived, that actually the one path forward that actually seems to have made a difference is energy and is engineering and science.
Okay, so I guess I would say, first of all, a clarification. So if one of the tasks of the energy humanities is to complete the picture, in a sense, the historical picture, the cultural picture, then it's not really, it doesn't really matter what happens, right? It's the sense that we don't know things socially and culturally because we never thought about them in terms of energy. So I would go back to just these two examples of Andreas Malm and Timothy Mitchell. We have one narrative about, say, the development of unionization, or one narrative about the development of masculinity as an idea that goes beyond the current kinds of masculinity. And without energy as part of it, we've missed some fundamental parts of the narrative. So I still think there's a component to that. And the reason I made this division between this kind of analytic, let's just say they're kind of a bit crude, and speculative, is that the speculative one then is trying to take seriously that interlinkage. Okay, so if it's the case that somehow, not deterministically, but somehow there's some component of the elimination or the refiguring of left politics, especially around unionism, which is linked to energy and a specific kind of energy. Well, what happens when you have a different kind of energy? So it's kind of that. So it isn't just the substitution of one for another. If you have renewables, you don't need one site of energy that brings it to elsewhere. You have your own site of energy. That can produce libertarian fantasies, that can produce small communes, that has the capacity to produce energy in places where it never had it. That can produce, I know there's like feminist energy communes in places like Zanzibar. Don't know yet. So there's speculative things that are developing. So I guess that's kind of my response to the energy humanist part. The speculative is always going to be the more dangerous, and the part that can be that can just be wrong, right? It can just miss the boat. It can make too big of a claim, and that's okay. When it comes to technology being the solution, so I guess I would point to a couple of things there. There are at least 3 other moments when there was the capacity for electrification and the production of a little bit different, but the production of renewable energies, maybe more. So the capacity to produce energy from the sun actually goes back to the 19th century. Very primitive technologies, but there is that capacity. It doesn't get developed for various kinds of reasons that are political reasons. First automobile vehicles were electrified. The reason that they became fossil-fueled vehicles has very little to do with the development of technology. It's about the selection of one technology versus another. Solar panels post I should make one other step. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a French governmental project that produced water pumps in northern Africa using solar panel technology. It was eliminated. It was not eliminated because the technology didn't work. It was eliminated for other kinds of reasons having to do with actually France and its vision of itself as a nuclear power. 73, right? Once again, if you were to go to an archive and look at what was produced after the 1973 oil crisis, you would find board games about solar power, the birth of solar power. You'd find books about putting it on your own, building solar power onto your cabin in the woods. So again, the technology is there. Maybe it's not scalable. Maybe it's not as efficient. But the technology is not what's driving it, actually. What's driving it is interest, capacity, support from governments, and those kinds of things. So the role of technology is a bit confusing, I think. And in the interim, what the energy humanists would be interested in is this kind of that feedback loop we're talking about. So you say in Taipei that some of this doesn't make sense. There's some big freeways in Taipei. There's some big overpasses. A lot of moving around in the city is moving around under overpasses. There is Edward Yang film that Evelyn and I were watching, and a lot of the action takes place under underpass, where the relationship between two teenagers takes place. It's figured into life. There may be motorcycles. Most of them, from what I can see, just, there's no study here. I didn't count them, but there's very few electric motorcycles. So there's still ways in which a place like Taiwan, or I can point to any place, still has lots of these fantasies, especially about individual households, suburbanization, perhaps. So, I take your point to a degree, but I don't think it impacts the energy humanities so much as that speculative part. But I do think you need the speculative part to think about, like, if the claim about how they're tied together, I think fossil fuels and all kinds of other developments is right. And you're doing it in part to say, like, the grand gesture of the energy humanities is to say, no, you shouldn't be doing a study about energy as a historian. As a historian, what you should be looking at is how energy figures into the history that you used to study. And you'd never thought about energy and how it figures into that. The speculative part is the trickier part for the reasons I mentioned, but because perhaps it is the case that you can manage to have a completely solar-powered world. To go back to your earlier comment, I'm not sure that that's going to work. And so you need a politics still to go alongside the technology. The technology is key. There's no question.
Yeah, I think the big problem in a way is probably fertilizer much more than as we're seeing right now.
Let's not even go there. Let's not even go there.
Yeah. Okay.
That's another fossil fuel question.
Yeah.
Issue.
And one where the question of it's simply not substitutable in the same way, I guess. That, yeah. Anyway.
Well, again, though, I would say that was a decision made, and if there's another thing that there's a lot of pushback on, it's about fertilizer. It's about the idea that you could possibly substitute for fertilizer from the Haber-Bosch process to have adequate development. And this too was a project. It was a project post-war, very determinate project, and now it's treated as a common sense. And that has displaced other kinds of agriculture. Right. It's, again, in a feedback loop. It led to more and more, or at least was connected to greater increases in population. And you wouldn't have those if you didn't have the same level of agriculture as industry, which has its, let's not even go there. That would depress me more than the...
Yes.
Yeah. I think we have like 15 minutes left, and I see so many young faces here. So I think a lot of people would be curious about the why energy humanities matters. So now the floor is open. So is there anybody who wants to ask questions? Wow, I see so many faces. And 如果各位觉得英文没有办法表达你们的情绪，也欢迎用中文，就是我们这边有 professional 的 interpreters.
Okay, I actually want to ask a question on population because one of the consequences of fossil fuel is the overpopulation that is currently threatening our livelihood. And I should discuss this with Professor Burke-Taylor before. But anyway, on the one hand, the neo-Malthusians think that there should be a triad system to limit population growth and prevent suffering, but such thoughts are dismissed as inhumane. But as Professor Burke-Taylor pointed out in his essay, and I quote, "Overpopulation threatens to debase all human lives and to make them expendable. The imperatives of averting it entails that some of these lives may or even must be treated as debased and expendable." It seems whether we try to forcefully limit the growth of our population or not, one way or another, some human lives will be treated as expendable. And so with that, I want to ask, how do we limit population growth without violating human rights? And that, does renewable energy make a change in this predicament?
I think we just collect several questions and Professor could answer all together. So.
Really appreciate the very thoughtful discussions and insights. So we all know that we're entering a new age, right? The age of AI. And arguably it could be a phase transition to arguably a new civilization for humanity. I'm just curious, what's in your opinion, will technology breakthrough or human coordination accelerate the process more? Okay, so I want technology versus the human coordination. All right, as we transit to the AI age. Okay, that's my question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have a question that I think I found it very interesting in the last few years, how this concept that you already mentioned of net zero is so central. Even here in Taiwan is one of the main framing of the energy transition. What do you think about this concept? Is it dangerous? Is it a positive one? I'm just curious about that.
I'll do them in reverse order, and if I get back to yours, and because yours is hard, I'll if I forget, let me know. So I think net zero, simply by the fact, I mean, the evidence suggests that it's not been particularly useful. And some of that is temporal. So that is to say, net zero, when it's attached to a date, and the date was set initially quite far away. Now as we're getting closer, when the date is kind of deliberately set down the road, you can take a long time to get there, and it doesn't seem very, very serious. And it does not seem to have, as a rhetoric, as a powerful political rhetoric, it does not seem to have motivated governments to do very much in the way that one might have expected it could. So I'm not quite clear about, I don't think it's been as useful as it could be. I think it's confusing. I don't know if that's always clear as what it means. So it doesn't mean we have zero CO2. It means that we have figured out a way to get enough CO2 out of the atmosphere to match production. And what that then produces is ideas about things like carbon capture and technology, or carbon accounting, or these kinds of things that are linked to things like AI, and we'll come to that. So most of the large tech companies, which I was talking about this afternoon, they claim that a lot of their production facilities are net zero. And that's because of various kinds of strategies they use for carbon accounting, where if you have a forest, there's a NTU as a forest, you could sell carbon credits for some profit, and then they're net zero. So it seems to me to be accounting trickery, and there's probably other ways to have done this. One of them would be to not link it to time in quite the same way, but to make it as a demand immediately. So I've said this many times, but it's kind of like this, net zero. And I'll kind of appeal to an essay by, or a short book by French philosopher Jacques Rancière. His critique of liberalism is that liberalism suggests that like slowly you will get to equality. You know, slowly women will make as much as men, and that shows something good is happening in your society. He says instead the correct politics is to say, no, it should be right now equal. Men should make the same as women right now. And if it's not happening, then there has to be accountability. So I think it would work better if net zero was something like that. Like, so the demand is, this should be happening immediately. Now, politically, tell me why it's not happening. So I don't think it matters very much. The AI question is a hard one in a sense, because it doesn't quite fit with what I've been saying, but I can speculate on it. When I think about AI, it's more in terms of energy use and resource use. And those are both alarming. I don't know if they're as alarming as it seems to be, but that's my concern in terms of whether human beings or AI are how they're gonna play it out. I just don't know. I don't really think that the current forms of AI are very AI, I suppose. That's what I understand. So I don't know what happens down the road. I think it's a little bit of a version of perhaps EVs, where we concede that's a very tentative connection, but we concede to it that it solves issues for us, and then we don't bother solving those issues ourselves. So we concede, oh, that can write a better essay for me. And then I don't really have to, it's hard to write an essay. Oh my God, why would I bother? So it seems like it's fine. So that's the kind of the move that is debilitating for human beings. Malthusianism. So I generally try to avoid talking about Malthus at all. It's dangerous. It's linked to, I mean, Malthus gets beat up for that essay on population, even though he wrote all kinds of other things and was connected with the development of early economics in intriguing ways. I guess I don't quite know, because I've tried to think about this, and maybe my guests here can say more about it. The proper thing to say is that population is not the problem. That's, I will tentatively say that that's a tricky proposition. I hadn't thought of it this way. I like the sense of overcapacity, meaning that some people don't matter. Because that sounds right to me. I think, is that what you're saying? What were you saying?
It's complicated. I mean,
okay.
What the passages you was quoted was me trying to reconstruct the logic of the neo-Malthusians.
Okay. Yeah, I don't like that. So it's the anxiety I have when you don't think something about population is that it really depends, the capacity to manage a lot of population demands some kind of decoupling, narrative of decoupling of the production of technology, of energy, of agriculture from population growth. That somehow you can do the one without the other. And I don't know if that works or hasn't worked. And so I'd rather not reinforce that idea, but I just don't think population is the right place to look. And certainly I guess I would say I don't quite get how it works in energy. The issue with energy is that there's no question, energy is linked to development. So if you want people to be developed, you want them to have the capacity that comes with energy. Well, question. So if there's more people, then they will use a lot more energy. So then the question becomes, the project becomes, there's lots of kinds of energy. What kinds of energy we're going to use? So I would also then, I have to think more about what we were talking about over dinner, which is about population decline in some places versus population increase in others, because it would be an inverse relationship. I think where there's lots of energy, high levels of energy use right now, you have population decline, but that is certainly more than offset by population increase and energy increase elsewhere. So I don't know how that's going to play out. If it's renewables, because that's the other kind of like, if you jump over having to be fossil fuel creatures, then it doesn't matter. That has not happened it's happening, but not perhaps as fast as it could. And that produces problems for the project of energy transition. The project is still there, but something like that. Neo-Malthusianism, I don't care about that.
Thank you very much, Professor Szeman. I would like to imagine how you would speculate upon the current war, right? Because obviously we have the fertilizer issue involved as well, right? So and they haven't actually invested enough on pipelines in those countries. Right. So I would like to see how would you fit the current war, the development of the current war in Iran within your energy humanities. Do you think it will perhaps conform to your narrative, or would you see it is actually a good point for renewables to develop, right? Because we are lack of petrol, but perhaps the renewable will have another chance.
I can make some speculations. I would say that I always hesitate about energy humanities doing a lot with the geopolitics of war, and I'll explain why in a minute. But it more or less tells you, and especially in this case, because I don't think if you're in international relations, it's very hard to map what the logic is to this war. Okay, so you can account for it, but if you read foreign policy, or if you read other accounts, if you look at The Economist or things like this, they all have wildly different reasons, because I don't think there's very much of a logic to it. But let's just say this at a minimum. It certainly shows the degree to which there is a commitment to a necessity of fossil fuels on the part of lots of countries. It certainly suggests to a lot of countries that they need to be attentive to energy sovereignty. That has already been developing. But one of the things that is a potential something that will emerge. One thing that'll emerge is new kinds of relationships between countries who need natural gas. They'll buy it from somewhere else. They'll kind of cut Iran out of the picture, knowing that there's always going to be issues probably. But in other places, they just will be like, no, we need this. We cannot deal with this level of instability. We're going to switch as much as possible to renewables. A great example being Pakistan. They just don't have access to their own gas and oil, and so they just don't want to bother with that, because that will always render them in a bad situation. Probably will expand and accelerate renewables in India, which is already happening. So it kind of says we can't depend, we can't rely, we can't be in a world where these great powers can make decisions around that will affect our energy supply. We can't depend on that. But it can go in lots of different directions, because you're right. You were saying that it could be the development of more pipelines within the continent, within the Near East and in Asia more generally. So it's kind of a confusing situation, but I would say that when it comes to energy transition, this has the potential, at least, to push energy transition at a faster pace. If you have renewables, this doesn't matter to you. this war. The war, of course, still matters to all of us because we don't want to have loss of life. We don't like the injustices of this war. But you can take out a gas plant, a refinery, very easily. It's much harder to take out a wind farm with bombs. So it kind of gives you a sense of this. You can have a solar field damaged from bombing. It's very easy to replace. You can have this is the speculative part. If your whole community has balcony solar panel, well, you don't need distributed electricity. So it just changes the nature of how things work and who has control over your circumstances. And when right now you have to move energy from one place to another, that produces a lot of control. And that's why the Strait of Hormuz matters so much. So I don't know if that answered your question or not, but it at least has that potential. It's unclear to me if that's what will be the outcome or if the other direction of the energy sovereignty issue is some places will scramble to get more natural gas, right? And again, these I can't remember how you said it, but it was really nice about these fascist fantasies. They are hoping this will animate that, but it's probably a miscalculation.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Szeman, for the really for the fascinating talk. I mean, from a perspective, it's darkest time and it's also the brightest time to discuss about the energy humanities. But I think the most important thing is that we have to do it now. Otherwise, we will be kind of left by the changing geopolitical situation or the invention of new energy regions. So if you want to know more about the developments of energy humanities, please take a look at Professor Szeman's book, The Futures of the Sun. It's actually open access. You could just simply Google the book name. You could have read the whole text about the current development of the energy humanity. So finally, time's up. So let's thank you, Professor Szeman, for the talk.